This Photography News podcast is sponsored by MPB. There's never been a better time to make good use of your kit, inspire others, make some extra cash, and make a difference. Sell your used kit today at mpb.com/sell and let someone else love it as much as you have.
Stay tuned for the Photography News podcast, where you'll find black and white technique, Nikon Z9 critique, and the wide-angle lenses you seek.
Hello and welcome to the latest Photography News podcast. My name is Roger Payne. I'm the editorial director at Photography News. And in light of the impending energy price hike in the UK, I'd like to introduce my two colleagues based on the number of layers they're wearing to avoid putting the heating on. So let me start first by welcoming multi-layered contributing editor, Mr. Kingsley Singleton. Morning, Kingsley.
Good morning. Is it still morning?
Oh, I don't know.
No, it's afternoon.
No, it's the afternoon.
Good afternoon, Roger and Will.
And how many layers are you wearing to avoid putting the heating on?
I've got three layers. I've got t-shirt. I've got a sort of a fleecy long sleeve thing, and then a gilet or a body warmer or vest, depending on where you're from in the world. My answer to the energy crisis is also more raw processing, because when my computer gets a bit hot and bothered, it starts fanning out hot air. So I've got a husky covering my feet and a raw processing heater, and that's how I'm going to combat this situation.
Sounds perfect. Wonderful. And introducing who also looks rather wrapped up, editor of Photography News, Mr. Will Chung. Hi, Will.
Hi, guys. How are we doing?
We're good. You look. In all honesty, you look more wrapped up than Kingsley does. How many layers have you got on?
Well, the thing is, I actually only got 3 layers, but then that's only because I've been taking the advice of that chap from the energy company who inappropriately suggested you do some exercise to keep warm. So I've just been doing some star jumps to keep warm. So I did have 4 layers on, and I am now down to 3.
Right.
Yay.
So star jumps and raw processing is the way forward to heat your home in the months and years ahead. Well, welcome both. Welcome, of course, to the 36th podcast that we're doing. Can't believe we're that old so soon. But as we always start our podcast, we have a quick chat about what we've been photographing ourselves since we last got together. And I know that the pair of you have both been doing something similar. But Kingsley, I'll come to you first. I understand that you've had a new camera to have a little bit of a play around with.
I've got pause on with the Nikon Z9, which is very exciting, and was a very welcome piece of good luck. Or good luck, a pleasant thing to turn up on the doorstep in a week where I also managed to have an exploding car tire and flew my drone into said car as well. I don't think those two things were connected though. But yeah, the Z9, fantastic. I mean, I've had a couple of trips out with it so far, sort of nowhere near into kind of fully kind of embracing what it is. But it's very, very, very impressive.
And certainly this is a camera that you are, I believe, considering purchasing yourself. So first impressions, you've just pulled a face to suggest that maybe your accountant won't allow that. But first impressions, is your wallet feeling the strain already?
Accountant stroke wife. I mean, I think the not that they're the same person, I should point out. It's one of the things that I've been thinking about it as I've been using it is some of the on costs in cameras like that. And like, to get the best out of that camera, one of the things you immediately need to do is to invest in 2, because it's a dual card slot. So you want to be buying a couple of those, and they're CF Express Type B cards. You know, you probably want a reasonable size of card, like 128 gig plus. It depends, if you're going to be shooting video on it, probably even more. And, you're looking at like high hundreds in terms of just buying the media for the thing, and that's after spending $5,500 on the body. Now obviously it's a professional camera, so we shouldn't be surprised that it comes with sort of quite high price tags. But I mean, aside from that, it's great. I mean, I don't know whether in the short time I've had to use it so far, I'm not convinced that it's something that I need. Obviously, in our kind of society, we have a complex relationship between want and need, don't we?
Yes. And I mean, and I suppose that's ultimately the question is, what will convince you? Did you have a plan when the camera landed? Did you in your head have a view of what it needed to do to enable you to go, yes, this is an absolute no-brainer?
I think that it's already answered those questions for me insofar as the EVF, the sort of the blackout free EVF, which is the situation where you're not getting an interrupted view when you're shooting at a high kind of frame rate, is brilliant. And the weird thing about that though is I went out on a couple of occasions and shot sort of wildlife and dogs running around and stuff. And to be honest, I didn't even think about it. Like I wasn't framing up and shooting like at 10 frames a second, 20 frames a second and thinking, wow, there's no blackout. It did what it's supposed to do, which is for you not to notice. So, completely connected to the subject, which is brilliant. And the AF, compared to the Z7 II I've got, which, I think is a great camera. The AF on it is excellent. The Z9 AF is like 5 times better.
Right.
It's so kind of sticky and reactive that I found that when I was shooting sort of animals coming towards me, that it generally on the Z7 II wasn't best to go into the animal eye AF mode because it was a bit sluggish in terms of keeping up with like something that's moving fast. Stationary subject's great. It works, most of the time perfectly. But this one, the Z9, you could probably keep it on that. And, and when it loses the eye, it picks up the head. If it loses the head, you get like an array of points across the body. So it's doing all the things that it's supposed to do. Going back to your question, though, it's kind of like, well, how much time do I actually spend doing that? Actually shoot, because this is a sports and action camera. There's no two ways about that. That's what it's for. It's it's for guys at trackside or the edge of the pitch and stuff. And as much as I would love all of the capability of it, you have to start asking yourself the question of whether you actually need it.
Now, of course, before I move on to Will, it would be remiss of me, Kingsley, to not ask a little bit more about the detail of you managing to pilot your drone into your car. Is this user error or some other explanation?
It's 50-50. It's 50% the elements and 50% user error. Basically, I was landing it near the car and there was a gust of wind but the drone was pointing at me, and your reaction is then to steer left away from the car. But because the controls are inverted because it's looking at me, it goes in the opposite direction. So all it did was it just sort of clipped the back and span down like about a foot. I mean, I've seen lots of videos of people who've flown into trees and they've crashed and they've still been okay afterwards. But I haven't actually. The longer it's gone on, the more the hope is building in me that it might be okay. But I then can't. It's like checking your lottery results. The longer you can kind of convince yourself that you might have won something, it's almost like the kind of the pleasure is in the wondering.
So you're leaving it for a rest.
Maybe, or it may sort of heal itself Terminator style. I don't know.
Well, we shall await with interest to discover the fate of the drone. So moving on to you, Will, while Kingsley's been talking there, you've been waving around the very camera that Kingsley has also been playing with, and that's looks like an impressive setup. So that is a Z9 with a 7200.
No, that's with a Nikon 100 to 400 millimeter zoom, which we've got testing as well in photography news. So I've been playing with this, as you say. I only had a couple of days as well. I went out yesterday in a spare half an hour to the local lake, and I tried to set up with all the various controls you need for autofocusing with birds. So I've been watching a lot of YouTube and watching these bird photographers track animals with the Z9. So I kind of set up with eye detect, continuous focusing, 20 frames per second, etc., etc. And I was amazed, actually. I was very, very impressed. I haven't yet done a side-by-side with something like, the Canon EOS R5, which is also very, very good for this sort of thing. But just from half an hour by the lake, I was very impressed. And I have to say, one thing we've talked about recently, of course, is the advantages of mirrorless and DSLR. But one thing about this with its electronic shutter was that in 20 minutes, I shot 800 frames, 800 pictures.
Right.
Can you imagine the wear and tear in your SLR if you went out every afternoon and spent 20 minutes shooting 800 frames? And of course, those 800 frames, most of them were rejects because they were flying gulls. But when I have to say, looking at the pictures, and I haven't gone granular on it yet. I haven't dug too deep into it, but where the focus is right, it's very right. Sometimes there's a little off, and obviously there's human error in this as well, because I'm not a flying bird expert photographer. But there was a lady turned up with some food for the birds, which is great. And as they were dipping in and out, I was just blasting away with this very, very quiet shot at 20 frames per second, and hence why I shot 800 pictures in no time at all.
And in terms of, so I mean, both you and Kingsley clearly are quite sold on the capabilities of the AF system. But what's it like as a camera to actually pick up and use? It's quite a brutish thing, isn't it? I mean, aesthetically and sort of ergonomically, how does it feel in the hand?
Well, it is a deep-bodied camera, and of course the disadvantage with it is the fact it is a deep-bodied camera. So by comparison with the Sony A1 and the Canon EOS R5, both have add-on power grips if you want them. So it is, oh gosh, it is a bit of a brute. And yeah, you could do some weightlifting with this to keep warm as well, I suppose. But it's very handleable. I mean, I enjoyed its handling. I mean, okay, I do use Nikon, so I'm familiar. But I do enjoy its handling. And just to go back on AirFrog, I haven't said it's great yet, because I haven't really given it a good hiding with other fast-moving objects. But I am impressed so far. But no, I enjoy the handling of it, and it is, with this particular lens, quite heavy. But then, any comparable camera and lens would be similar anyway. So it's fine. I've enjoyed it so far immensely.
Good stuff. And so that's going to be in the next issue of the magazine, I presume. The review will be in not the issue that's just gone to press this week, but the one after that, I take it.
That's right, issue 97. And as you've mentioned, issue 96 is just going to press. In fact, I hope to push the button on it today. And it's our announcement of all our award winners. So thanks to all the readers who voted for our awards. These are for the best products and services over the last year. So the results are in the issue out now. And, I know you're going to ask me more about the issue, Rod, so I'll preempt you. Two other things to note. One is I finished testing the Zeiss Zx1, which we mentioned on the last pod. Really quite interesting product. It's a bit strange, but quite interesting product. So well worth reading about. It is a camera that is for £5,000 and has got built-in Lightroom, but it's quite interesting. And just the other announcement, and I need a drum roll for this, but
we will insert one. Hang on a minute, Bill. Let me just pause a moment, and we will insert one at this point.
But we are announcing in the issue the date for Photo 24. Now, for listeners who aren't familiar with Photo 24, it's an event we've had over a number of years, obviously missing the past two due to the pandemic. But it's a 24-hour photographic festival in London. I normally try and plan it around the middle of June, around Midsummer's Day, the longest day of the year. So I'll go for a weekend of that. And it's just a free, fun event for readers, and everybody's invited. And we have got some innovations this year that hopefully involve not just people who come along to the event on the day, but involve everybody. So if you're in, Clacton or Edinburgh, whatever, you can still get involved in some way in Photo 24. But the key thing is, at the moment, all that detail is to come. But the key thing is the dates, and that is June the 25th and the 26th. So for those of you who fancied a photographic challenge with a difference, put those dates in your diary. Keep your eye on the magazine and the website for more details to come. Sorry, Roger, I diverted from using the Nikon and everything else and what I've been shooting straight into the issue. And I know we should go back to you and ask you about because you've been doing wildlife photography yourself, haven't you?
I have been doing a little bit of wildlife photography, but not in a slightly more controlled environment. And that is, as you guys both know, but the listeners will not know, is that my photography was curtailed towards the back end of the last year because a lot of the time I went out with the camera was with my dog. But unfortunately, very sadly, we lost our dog in November last year, and actually we've only just got back on the dog horse, so to speak, and I've got a new puppy to keep us entertained. So I've been trying my damnedest to try and get some pictures of her, but it turns out that puppies don't do what you want most of the time, or any of the time. In fact, it seems that for 24 hours of the day, or 23 hours and 45 minutes, she does exactly what we don't want her to do. But for those 15 minutes, I have tried to grab a few shots, but it is damned difficult because she won't sit still. As soon as you get down on the floor with her, she heads towards you. So it is quite tricky. So Kingsley, maybe you can offer some advice as a eminent dog photographer yourself.
Well, yeah, get a Nikon Z9.
Is that it?
Or in fact, wait until they're slightly more tired. That would be my generic tip for letting them slow down a little bit and get their enthusiasm out of the way. And then, that's why you end up with a lot of pictures of sleeping puppies.
Yes.
That's the point at which they're easiest to photograph, I think.
Yeah, I'll try that though. Definitely a sleepy dog is a more easy subject, theoretically at least. No, good stuff on the issue, Will. Very excited about Photo 24. We did, I think we'll put it out there now, but we did mention as we were preparing to record this podcast that we might try and do some form of live podcast on the Photo 24 event because we'll all be there. So, interesting stuff. Look forward to reading about the ZX1. I'm really interested in that from on the basis of the conversation last time round. This Photography News podcast is sponsored by MPB. Use their free online valuation tool to instantly find out exactly how much your gear is worth. Get super fast payments straight into your bank account, and if you change your mind at any point up until you get paid, they'll ship it back for free. Moving forwards, we thought that as a main subject this time round, we might talk about black and white photography or monochrome photography, depending on your preference there. We're 36 podcasts into this series, and we haven't actually sort of put black and white to one side and talked about it in any detail. So we're going to rectify that right now. And Kingsley, I'm going to start with you because when I put around the idea about talking about black and white photography, you said I haven't done it for ages. So I suppose the obvious question is, why haven't you done it for ages?
Thanks for coming to me first, Rog. My I've got nothing much to say on the subject. No, obviously I've got stuff to say on the subject. I think it's to me, probably the reason for that is that to me it's a kind of a conscious and very deliberate choice to shoot in black and white, and it's just not something that I have been kind of energized to do for quite some time. Like, I don't think that I would kind of necessarily go out and shoot some pictures and sort of think, after the event, I wouldn't necessarily go and think, that might work in black and white, I'll try that. That's not a habit that I'm sort of still in. But like an example of the stuff that I would, and now that we're talking about it, feeling kind of quite inspired to go and do, would be to do something like go and do sort of some minimalist landscapes or long exposure landscapes, with kind of vast amounts of kind of emptiness in them. And I think stuff like that tends to work very well in black and white. So for me, it would be like a deliberate component of the image.
Sure. So Will, you're a big proponent of black and white photography. What do you think is the reason that it's worth doing? What's the appeal from your perspective?
Roger, it's actually quite a difficult question for me to answer in some ways because I grew up in black and white where I was using film cameras, and you either put in a color slide film or a color negative film or a black and white film. And I grew up with black and white because it was cheaper to use at the time. And I got used to seeing in black and white, if that makes any sense. So I visualize pictures in mono rather than color, and it's still the case now. So even though I shoot full color because I'm shooting raw, I'm often looking at things going, I'll make a great black and white subject. So it's a difficult answer because it's in some ways it's instinctive. And I think that's why, to take an example with my partner, Annie, who's very much a nature photographer and a color photographer, I don't think she'd mind me saying, but she kind of struggles to see in black and white because she sees in color. And for me, it's the other way around. I struggle to see sometimes color. But I love black and white for its graphicness, the use of its texture. And as a photographer who likes contrast, I do like pushing up those blacks and making those highlights sing, so that it's really not quite sort of whitewash, but quite graphic, because that's I'm inspired by photographers, for instance, like Bill Brandt, who, if you look at his work, his black and white was very, very stark, and that's what inspired me to take up photography all those years ago. So that's why I love black and white.
And is that a good place to start for somebody who hasn't photographed very often in black and white, to actually look back Because you mentioned there people like Bill Brandt, there's obviously Ansel Adams, that type of thing. Kingsley, do you think that's a good starting point for somebody to kind of get some inspiration, get some ideas, is to look back at the old photographers and see what they did?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I don't necessarily think it has to be like historic photography, and obviously, like, we do associate black and white with historic kind of photography because, like Will was saying, that's kind of all there was. And it's like one of those odd things, isn't it? That it was a massive restriction, but which has now become an aesthetic choice. But if you want to, if you're interested in black and white and you're looking to kind of develop into it, I would definitely say to take some time and look at the kind of images that you are drawn to, scan black and white images, see what you like and sort of what works for you, because it pretty quickly it will become apparent that, obviously there are certain subjects that work in color which don't work in black and white, like rainbows, for instance, and poppies and stuff like that, brightly colored insects. I mean, this is what I'm sort of was trying to get out before, insofar as it is very much an aesthetic choice. It's not like, I think that a lot of the mistake that a lot of people make is that they think that if they've taken an average picture in color, that they may be able to turn it into black and white and somehow, boost the contrast and somehow it'll work. Like, sometimes that does work, and sometimes you can find real gems that seem like nothing in color, but it's way more worth investigating kind of what makes black and white work as you're shooting. And we were probably going to come onto this anyway, but one of the great things about digital cameras is that you can, and mirrorless cameras in particular, is that you can effectively see in black and white by, setting the picture mode to black and white. And that will give you kind of a much, and also you can change stuff like the level of contrast as you're shooting, and maybe kind of see how that kind of stuff works. And it will definitely give you like a head start in terms of that process of seeing. And of course, what you can also do is, like, if you shoot RAW plus JPEG, so like if you're setting a black and white picture mode, like, say, with your Fujifilm cameras, there is a ton of really great black and white film simulation modes on those. And if you set one of those, you'll be able to see how it's working through the viewfinder or through the screen. But if you shoot RAW as well, as far as I'm aware, I think it might vary from model to model, but in my experience, the RAW will always be the original RAW in color. So you'll have that as a backup, and you'll be able to kind of process that differently if you want, but you will also have this kind of sort of immediate black and white record.
So Will, just in terms of this thing that you mentioned about seeing in black and white, I think that's sort of worth investigating a little bit more, because I think a lot of photographers do say, oh yeah, it's about visualizing the scene in black and white. So I suppose, before we get into the kind of how you do that, is there do you firmly believe that any subject works in black and white? Obviously Kingsley said about rainbows and poppies and brightly colored insects, but does any subject work with black and white, or do you have some sort of personal favorites that you tend to lean towards?
I think black and white works for probably more subjects than people think. Obviously Kingsley makes a very good point, and there are some things that wouldn't work, and there are some subjects when you make them black and white would jar with some people. For instance, wildlife photography, for instance, some people might not want to see their lines in black and white, but I don't know if you can see behind me, but I've got a picture of a line lying in the that I shot in the Masai Mara, and it's beautiful in colour, but actually the one I've got on the wall is hanging in black and white. So it's kind of an aesthetic thing. But I think most subjects work very well in black and white. And as mentioned before previously, podcasts and in the magazine, indeed, I've been doing a pier project. This is piers that stick out into the sea, and they're fundamentally a very colourful subject. All bright primaries if you go on the things, with the fairground rides, etc., etc. But I'm just playing with them, making them black and white at the moment. I haven't finalised how I'm going to process them. But the beauty of it is, Kingsley's talked about, when you visualise black and white when you're out shooting. But for those of us who've got loads and loads of pictures and you're not quite sure, and you use a software like Lightroom, can't even say it. But there's a very quick option where at the top right-hand corner there's a colour tag and a mono tag. You can quickly switch between the two. So, if you're shooting is one thing, but if you've got an archive of work like we all have, and you're not quite sure how it works, just go through your archive of your favorite pictures and just click between the two. It's not definitive because, once you go into black and white and you start processing it, the things you do, but it gives you a very quick preview of how your previous shots would look, and that's a way of starting as well. So yeah, shooting is, and how you see is one thing, and when you are out shooting, the thing I look for, as photographers should do, is the light. What's the light doing on this scene? If it's giving a nice side contrast light, picking texture up, bringing that tone, then hey, that could work in black and white and color. Right. And equally on some dull days, and I've had it before, when even in the rain, and you're struggling with color. I tell you what, rain in black and white can work really well because it adds a mood that the color doesn't. But it's it's not one thing fits all. And okay, the beauty of digital, if you're shooting raw, is that you basically shoot raw and you do what you want with it afterwards. So stay color, stay mono. Happy days.
So in terms of when you're out surveying a scene to photograph, if you were going to record it or visualize it in black and white, you would be looking primarily for things like contrast, texture, tone. What are the kind of, because I suppose there's also a consideration where you have to be aware of how colors replicate when you turn them black and white as well, right? So what's going through your mind, Will? What's the first sort of almost like boxes you have to tick in terms of, is it a tonal thing, is it a textural thing?
Well, if it's a scenic, it's normally the light and the sky,
right?
And I can worry about the foreground later. And things like tonal relationships matter a little less because you can fiddle with those in Lightroom or Photoshop, whatever plug software you want to use or plug in. So you can tinker with tonal relations a bit later on. But I look for literally contrast, texture, and what the sky's doing, which is really important with mono, and it's indeed as it is with color. But if I've got a nice sky with some nice fluffy cumulus in the up there, scuttling across the top of the sky or the horizon, it's I'm there with bells on, out with a wide angle lens, get some nice graphic foreground, and then work it from there. But I just shoot. To be fair, I don't think I do it because I said it's an instinctive thing. But often I don't think as much as I used to with black and white in terms of seeing the final result because the advantage with raw. I'm not sure if I put that very well, but I often with film I used to think very much more black and white than I do now, if that makes sense. Because then you were only shooting one particular medium, you didn't have that choice. So now you've got that flexibility. And often I do my, strangely enough, pre-visualizing when I'm back home and on the computer.
Right.
So I just blast away and just make the most of every scene, regardless of what medium I think that picture would end up as, and then work it from there.
And Kingsley, you were nodding away as I said my thing about recognizing the differences in colors and how they replicate in black and white. So does that mean you were agreeing wholeheartedly that it is an important part of the process where you need to know that a blue sky could actually turn out looking quite flat on a black and white image, or a red bus might actually turn out, not looking particularly, not really standing out against a grey building, for example?
No, I was nodding along. I was listening to the radio. There's a Neil Young song. Completely, I completely agree with that. Yeah, I mean, because what you're reducing it to, moreover, is sort of shape and form. So yeah, like one color will end up running into another, and sort of images can end up sort of seeming quite muddy, even though in color they seem very, very sort of striking and kind of contrasty. But I definitely think that kind of that kind of concept of simplicity is what sort of drives good black and white images. There would be an emphasis on kind of repeating shapes and form, or as Will says, light that is the sort of defining kind of characteristic of the image. So like, I suppose randomly kind of thinking about how, in the middle of the day, you might see a landscape, one of those kind of days in the peaks or Lake District or something where, you're quite high up and you'll see a bit of sunlight a long way off. The rest of the kind of the day is kind of grey. If you like in black and white, you can see something like that and you might think like, well, I'll spot meter on the highlight area and I'll create this very low key image, which kind of just seems to make more sense with the color removed. It's more striking and kind of dramatic in that way.
I was going to ask as well, because I was going to ask you again, Kingsley, is that I remember interviewing a wedding photographer, and I asked him when he kind of switched between color and black and white, because he produced sort of both images. And I think I'm pretty sure I'll be paraphrasing massively here, but effectively he said that he used black and white to show emotion. So when he was, capturing the sort of, people hugging and, the first kiss or the kiss of the bride and groom and all that sort of thing, it was very much a means to kind of emphasize the emotion of the day rather than just the recording of the events. I mean, does that make sense to you? Was something you agree with?
I would definitely agree with that to an extent in that by removing color aspects from it, you're kind of creating a situation where you're more intently focusing on the subject. So, so be that, and, whatever the subject would be, like, as you say, like if it's someone crying at a wedding, then it's immediately going to come across a lot clearer because there's nothing in the image to make your brain go, oh, that's a funny colored dress, or like, something like that. You're sort of simplifying it kind of to the point where you're creating a far more kind of dramatic moment.
Sorry, I'm just thinking, guys, as you were talking about, you were talking about tonal relationships before you went over to weddings. And one thing I used to do with film, of course, was have a bag full of filters in the with my camera when I was shooting black and white. So if I wanted to intensify a blue sky because of the way black and white film was sensitive, and that it was oversensitive to blue. So if you shot a blue sky with black and white film, it came out very pale without filter. So you added a yellow filter or an orange filter or a red filter to take out the excess blue. So I suppose one advantage I've got over people who maybe haven't shot with film using filters is that I think I can kind of see that. I think sometimes I go, I want to contrast the sky in the days of film, and go red filter. And now, of course, with the Lightroom process and others where you can adjust the sensitivity, you can replicate that, but you can't be using filters on the camera at the time. So I don't know. It's an interesting one, but I think the thing is with black and white, just to try it and do what Kingsley says, which is just set a black and white film simulation mode or whatever it is, whatever camera you've got, shoot JPEGs and RAW. So you've got the black and white JPEG and you've got the backup of RAW, and then learn from there.
I was going to go back slightly to what you were saying about kind of emotion. Like in our minds, we have this hardwired idea that black and white means that something's true. That somehow it's real because we associate it with classic street photography, with war photography and stuff like that. And like the weird kind of the weird contradiction in that is that it's not true. It's not a natural view, and yet somehow we associate it with truth. So again, sort of going back to your kind of wedding example, it cuts through the sort of the unnecessary stuff, and it appears to be a more kind of sort of telling and kind of realistic view of the world, even though it's kind of isn't.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting way of looking at it. And Will, you've kind of touched on it already in terms of how you set your camera up, etc. But and also about what you can do with your images after you've taken them into Lightroom or Photoshop or whatever. But obviously the sort of the processing side of this is a very important part of the equation, isn't it? So in terms of what you do with your images on your computer, and as you've already said, you can just flick it over to black and white in Lightroom, but presumably your process, your workflow is a little bit more in depth than that when it comes to actually producing a black and white image.
Yeah, often it is. Not always, but often it is. And certainly you can do an awful lot with Lightroom, because when you start going into it, you can do a quick black and white color switch over. But there's all sorts of profiles in Lightroom that come as standard now that you can load up and try. So there's contrasty ones, there's ones that add a bit of noise, film grain, effectively, some add vignettes. And there are also plenty of plugins around. One of the ones I use is from DxO. It's called Nick Silver Effects 3 now it is. It used to be a free software going back a while, thanks to Google, but DxO now charge for it. But to be fair, it's a very good software. And you go into that plugin and it's got any number of presets that you can dial into. I mean, some of them are quite extreme and quite ghastly, but there's some wonderful ones too. But the thing is, once you go into it, you don't have to use the presets, although you can do. But you can just you can pick film types to match. You can add noise, film grain. You can add vignetting. You can kind of dodge and burn using its control points, and that's one plugin. I'd recommend, but many people I know use just Photoshop or Lightroom and are happy with that. And I think you can do an awful lot with both those softwares. And if you've got Affinity Photo, fine, try that, or Corel. There are many softwares out there to use.
Absolutely. And Kingsley, I presume, as a bit of a doyen of Photoshop, I'm assuming that you would be more of a kind of channel mixer kind of guy, wouldn't you, when it comes to processing black and white?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, like Will's saying there's 1,000 ways to kind of take an image from color to black and white, and how you do it defines very much kind of how it looks. And the channel mixer is one of the ways you can do it, because it functions like the process of filtering for black and white film, insofar as if you open a tool like the channel mixer. I mean, the channel mixer actually is a almost like a bit of a legacy way of doing it, insofar as in Lightroom and Photoshop there are now black and white filters which do basically the same thing and kind of present the way that you do it in probably in an easier to understand way. So you'll have like sliders that say blue, green, red, cyan, that kind of stuff, and you drag them up and down, and it either lightens or darkens the associated tones in the color original. The one thing I'd say about that is that it's very easy to think something looks great when you're moving those sliders around, and then kind of not realize that it's an effect. If you push it too hard, right, you're sort of distorting the information that's in the original image, and it's an effect that's technically known as ripping the arse out of it. And what will happen is, then when you sort of zoom in, you'll kind of think, like, there's all this kind of weird fringing and kind of jaggedy lines around, kind of highlight areas and stuff like that. And that's because you're effectively taking the different colors in the original and sort of like pushing them really far apart from each other. So you're kind of creating this almost like interference in the image. So it's like, again, it's one of these things where you see something you want, but you have to do it with a certain amount of kind of subtlety. Otherwise, you can kind of sort of ruin the effect, I suppose. And it's a bit like with film grain effects that people add to things, which again, actually going back to that weird contradiction idea, is that, like, again, people kind of cover stuff in film grain, and the assumption is that it makes it look real. But again, it's doing the opposite, isn't it? It's like, you don't see with film grain, but doing it does give stuff like a kind of a quality of kind of documentary realness. And of course, like Will was saying, there are 10 different ways you can add film grain now, and some people do it manually. They kind of, I've done this before, where you shoot a load of like actual black and white film against like a grey wall or something, and you can then basically blend that proper film grain into an image using layers. And there are I can't remember the specific software now, but as Will was saying, there are softwares that kind of will replicate traditional film grain, and like whether anyone can really tell the difference is a matter for a different discussion. But they look great when you add them, and you can control the opacity of them and the strength and the size of the grain and all sorts.
Go on, Will.
Just one thing on film grain, and maybe a lot of digital photographers don't appreciate it, but it's much more coarse than you might think with black and white film. And the only reason I mention that is because I've copied a few negatives recently, and once I copied, I've basically put the thing on a light table, the negative there is put on the light table flat and copied it directly. And I copied some films like Ilford FP4, which is a medium speed film. It's much more grainy than you think. And when you add grain there to digital, sometimes people don't do it right because they're too kind. It's actually film is much more noisy or granular than you might think, or maybe as well processed. I don't know, but certainly you get some lovely effects. It certainly gives your work also a signature, a style. And I know many photographers are always after getting their own look, and adding grain and processing appropriately. And doing the extreme stuff, I mean, Kingsley mentions you get all these jaggedy edges and halos. And to purists, they throw their hands up in despair. And I've certainly known camera club judges to do the same thing, or mark a picture down because of halos. But, if you want to add a bit of style, what the hell? And it's better still if you can sell it too. And I know some photographers who do with over-processed work. Do very well, thank you very much.
You're taking me back to the days of T-Max at 3200, Will.
Oh, yes.
And pushing Tri-X with D76 Developer and various other things like that. But, what I mean, I suppose the final piece in the jigsaw is the output. So once you've processed it and once you've captured it and processed it, in terms of the output, Will, again, I'm imagining that you print quite a lot of black and white out, presumably on a color printer, but presumably a photo printer, so you get as much sort of tonal subtlety as possible. Yeah,
I have an Epson printer which has got 3 black and white inks, and 3 inks for black and white, and that is that definitely helps. I mean, in the Epson I've got, there's a photo black, a light black, and a light black, so that helps with all the shades of grey that you get with on a nice fully toned image. And if you can do your own printing, that's great. But equally, of course, there are many online labs that will do a good print if you supply a good file and make sure you follow their profile guidance too. And I've got a chemical wet darkroom background, and I used to print on glossy fibre paper that when it was air dried had a sheen to it rather than a high gloss.
Yeah.
So I mean, my paper's a choice. I use papers from Permajet and Photospeed. I like their Burrata collections in both, because it has that kind of creamy warmth that you get with chemical papers, and that's kind of, like I said, my background. So, I mean, oddly enough, our 2 award winners in our awards, which we mentioned at the beginning of the show, Permajet Distinction 320 was voted by the readers, and my editor's choice with a Photospeed Platinum Signature 300 Burrata, and both those papers I can recommend. But equally, if you want to do the fine art textured paper thing, fine, nothing wrong with that. If you want to try like a Halamulla natural line type paper to give it texture, nothing wrong with that either. So there's no one size fits all here. Just look for papers that you like the look of and what suits your images.
Kingsley, anything to add before we wrap up?
I suppose on the idea of presentation, it kind of, for me, it filters back into that idea of kind of consistency and kind of project work. And like when it comes to displaying stuff, I suppose from my own perspective, I would rather see a series of images wholly in monochrome rather than, like, say if you go onto someone's Instagram or their website, whatever, and there's kind of like a hodgepodge of color and black and white. To me, that doesn't feel like kind of the correct, like, Will's going to scowl at this and say people can do what they want, but like, which is true. But I think it's nice. To me, it's nicer to display stuff with kind of consistency, and that also feeds back into the idea of like that stuff we were talking about, processing, where, you know, if you do have a recipe that you like, you can usually sort of save that out. So like if there's a particular duotoning or grain or anything that you're doing, you know, it adds to that sort of consistency within like a black and white portfolio, and that's like a nice way to particularly to approach a project, you know. So if we went back to like Will's peers, you know, I'd be aghast if there was a mix of colour and black and white within that.
We'll await the exhibition. We'll await the exhibition. Well, that's really good stuff. Very interesting stuff there. Hopefully, we've inspired you a little to give black and white a try. As Will says, just go out and try it. The last time I did it, I actually set my X100S to a 1:1 square format as well, and shot exclusively in black and white on that. And that's actually quite a nice way of harking back to the old Rolleiflex and Hasselblad 6x6 backs and stuff. So yeah, definitely give that a go. But thanks, that's some really good stuff. So moving on, we're going to answer some listener questions. As this is a MPB sponsored podcast, thank you very much to them for continuing to support us. The first question we're going to throw over to them, and that comes from Jamie Forshaw, who emailed in and said, "I'd like to buy a used full frame Panasonic S series camera and have looked at prices on the MPB website. The S1 appeals, but there are a number of different versions with quite a variance in price. Can you advise on the key differences between the models, and which one would you suggest is best suited to general stills and video use?" So we sent this question over to Ian at MPB, and here's what he had to say.
Yep, a great question from Jamie there. Thank you. So Panasonic split the range of their S1 cameras in the same way, in a very similar way to how Sony do things. So they have an all-purpose camera, a high-resolution camera, and a video-centric camera. So in Sony's case, it's the A7 III. all-purpose A7R series as a high-resolution megapixel camera, and then you have the video-centric A7S series. So Panasonic are doing the same thing. The S1 becomes their all-purpose camera, the S1R becomes their high-resolution camera, and the S1H is their video-centric model. So starting right at the top of video, the S1H basically is extremely video-centric, one of the most video-centric kind of stills cameras that we've seen in recent years, or at least a camera that's kind of packaged in a stills kind of body. It's quite a bit larger than the other two, and it has kind of a button layout and obviously vents around it to allow for heat dissipation, owing to the stresses that are being put on the sensor because of the high video capabilities. So it has a lot of technology borrowed from their VariCam series of kind of cinema cameras. So it basically means much better codecs for clearer pictures and more lifelike color and highlights and color rendition in general. So you'll see that in the specs. I do suggest kind of looking at those specs and trying to understand them. Things like, for example, what 422 color means and the difference between 8-bit and 10-bit. And obviously the fact that a lot of the resolution readouts, 4K or 6K, are using the entire sensor. So these are features that are not available on the S1 and S1R. So it makes the camera very much video centric. So if you do have work coming in, for example, that requires the best in color, then the S1 or S1H is definitely the most video centric of all three. However, it does have a very healthy amount of resolution for stills as well. So it can very much be a very good stills camera as well. So moving down to the S1R. The S1R is basically just extremely high resolution camera at 47 megapixels, but still keeping the body quite small and in line with the S1. And that is the way to view the camera. It's effectively more geared towards stills because of the resolution. However, it does shoot video, and it shoots video very capably. But obviously, the S1H will have considerably better spec for that. And finally, and I guess it's probably the answer that you are really looking for here, is which is the best one for you for video and stills, and obviously that would be the S1. It is precisely that kind of camera. It's a camera that was made to be a stills and video camera as well. So it has 24.2 megapixels for the sensor for stills, but its video functions are also very, very good. And in fact, it's actually had a few recent updates to put it more in line with the S1H's video functions. However, it doesn't have the heat dissipating abilities of the S1H. Obviously, that's within the body, but in terms of getting amazing color and amazing bit rates as well, it is a fantastic camera. So for me, if you're very keen on doing both stills and video, then the S1 for me is the winner, hands down.
Well, hopefully that solves your problem, Jamie. Moving on to this next question. Will, we've already touched on printers today, so I'm going to come back to you on this one. This is a question that's been emailed in from Aidan Brearley, and he says, I've decided to invest in a printer to create some artwork for my rather bare walls at home. I was going to go A3 with models from Canon and Epson to choose from. Does the team have any personal preference on which manufacturer to go for, and what are the main differences between the two ranges? Will, as our resident printing expert, but Kingsley, don't think you're getting away scot-free on this one. Will, any particular thoughts and guidance for Aidan?
Well, loads, but I'm not sure if we can go through it all in a short podcast. But one thing for Aidan to consider, never mind the printer, but also think about the medium, and that's later on. There's such a huge choice out there right now, so don't be afraid of experimenting when you've got your printer. Which one do I have any personal preference for? Look, I'm an Epson owner, so I'm biased in that respect. But that said, the Canon printers are very, very good, obviously. I did test their Canon Image ProGraph Pro 300 a little while ago, and I was very impressed by that. And I don't want to give away all these secrets by our awards, but it happens to be a winner in our awards this year. And for a £700 printer, I think that was really excellent. In the same sort of ballpark from Epson is the SureColor P700, which is another A3 printer. And I mentioned in the black and white section about the inks, and yes, it's got those 3 black and white inks for great mono output, but it's very, very good with color too. I just noticed with one UK retailer, it's on sale for £575, which I think is a tremendous deal. But one thing about these both printers, of course, you need to think about the media, the follow up afterwards with media. Inks sadly aren't particularly cheap, although you don't replace the whole set in one go. You usually just replace one or two at a time. Like Photo Black for me goes very quickly. Mm-hmm. And with Epson printer, it's about 50 quid for one ink. So, that's one thing you do have to think about. But that said, I thoroughly recommend home printing. The thing's upstairs. It's on Wi-Fi, so it's not in the living room. And it's rather pleasurable to see. And again, nothing wrong with using online services, of course, but it's that immediacy which I rather like. But Aidan, yes, I do have a preference. Happens to be Epson, but I suggest you look at both brands, and that those two models I mentioned are certainly worth looking at, because they both perform really well. And once you got your printer, like I said right at the start, shop around for different medias, because they're all slightly different. They're kind of all the same, but very different at the same time, if that makes any sense. And that's one thing with media now, the choice is enormous. So whether you go for a bright glossy paper, a lightweight paper, a matte paper, a textured paper, the world is your lobster, as they say.
And so the two manufacturers will, there's not a huge difference between the printers in terms of functionality. Is it, or is there? I mean, is there a great number of inks with the Canon one, or is there any sort of key difference in that respect?
Well, there are some key differences, Roger. I mean, like I said, to go into them is a little difficult on a short podcast, but the Canon runs a 10 ink system, and I think Epson's an 8 ink system. Right. And they both offer inks that last for a long period of time, providing, of course, they're printed on the appropriate media. They're certainly both quiet. They both have nice functionality. One thing I do like about the Epson SureColor P700 is the fact that you can use roll paper on it. So if you like, for instance, I like printing panoramas, and you can use roller feed paper into that. I mean, it's not a cost saving; it's just a convenience thing. But the usability of both, I think, are very good. Both Wi-Fi, and both fairly quiet. I think slightly noisier, but it depends how if that's a problem for you. But certainly worth looking at if you can. And it's quite difficult in some respects, because it's difficult to check out what both printers do, because if you go to a retailer, they don't often, I'm sure there are some that do it, but there aren't often printers set up for you to go, I'll put a file through this or put a file through the other. And the only option might be to go to a show or a dealer day where they have an event. And there is the Society of Photographers convention coming up in March. And I know Canon and Epson are both, as I recall, are exhibiting there. So it's not practical for everybody, and Aidan might not want to wait, but it's those sort of events where you maybe get to try an A and a B. It's quite difficult to test otherwise.
Sure. Okay. No, good stuff. Good stuff. And Kingsley, I know you're not a massive sort of home printing person, but do you have any sort of preference in terms of models, like from Epson or Canon, or are you going to sit on the fence?
Well, wash your mouth out, Roger. I favour. I've got a Brother HL1210W. Which gives a beautiful high contrast laser jet print onto copy paper. No, I mean, I think Will's covered that off supremely well. I think the only thing I'd add is that the bigger the printer you get, the more space you need, the more your costs go up, because obviously A3 sheets and rolls are more expensive than smaller media, and sometimes it can be effective. Will did mention kind of printing online, but sometimes that can be the most effective solution. So for other people who are thinking about kind of making images from their prints rather from their photos, I think that's a great solution. The other thing I was going to add about the Society show is that Permajet are there, Online Paper are there, Fujifilm are there, and they'll all be offering kind of printing demonstrations and stuff as well, and I'm sure sort of plenty more companies besides. So that is a great way, as Will was saying, to kind of go and look at stuff and see kind of examples of what different papers will give you, and also examples of kind of how different printers work.
Yeah, good point. And I just want to question one of the things you've raised there, though. And Will, maybe just a quick question back to you on this is,
sure,
Kingsley, I mean, obviously costs of inks and print and paper, etc., are going to increase as you get bigger with a printer. But in real terms, per print, is it not cheaper to go for a bigger printer? In terms of because obviously your ink tanks on an A3 printer or an A2 printer are going to be larger than they are on an A4 printer. So would it not be fair to say that the inks are probably per print cheaper?
That's a great question, Rog, and I can hear my doorbell ringing, and so I'll pass it over to Will.
Will's got his head in his hands, so I'm not sure what to go with that. Go on, Will.
Well, it's a difficult question to answer, but I suppose in principle you're right, because the larger printers have bigger ink tanks. But then if Aidan doesn't want to do an A2 print, it's a bit of a sledgehammer to crack a nut scenario, isn't it?
True.
I think you have to accept the fact that if you take up home printing, there is a cost, and indeed there is a cost with any form of printing. But I think it's the control and the individualness of it and the immediacy of it that makes it appealing to me. And the fact that, of course, with raw art, you've got these variants, you've got all these different media you can try. And obviously, there are many labs that do offer different inkjet services, have your Loxes of the world or your One Vision Imagings and your Whitewall. They do offer printing on fine art materials. But you still don't have that ultimate choice that you can get if you went to Permajet or Photospeed or Halamula and looked at what they've got and you go, I'll try that really obscure paper I've never heard of before. And you might think it's really great, or equally it might not be because nobody's heard of it before.
But go on, Kingsley.
I was just gonna add, sort of from the point of view of sort of flip flopping around and not offering a definitive opinion of anything like I normally do. That I'm very kind of aware that home printing is a big deal, and people really love doing it, and therefore the concept of cost is kind of relative to how much enjoyment you're getting out of it, and it's almost as important as the picture taking process as well. So I'm not saying there's anything wrong with sort of spending decent cash on it, and if you love it, then it's great. It can be an incredibly absorbing thing to do, can't it?
Absolutely. Well, look, such an innocuous question, Aidan, and look at what you've caused. Well, there we go. So good answer, good stuff, chap. So Kingsley, I'm going to come back to you. I think this is right up your street, and this comes from Jane Markham, our last one today. And she says, I've been taking photographs for a couple of years now and really enjoy landscapes. Well, wonderful stuff. I currently just own a standard zoom lens, but I'd like to get a wide angle. Makes a lot of sense. Should I get a fixed wide angle or a wide angle zoom? And can you make any recommendations for my Canon EOS 850D? Kingsley, you're a bit of a landscapist. So any suggestions for Jane? First of all, wide angle zoom or wide angle prime?
I'd get a Z9 is what that's my no.
Does that fit on an 850D?
Be the answer to anything, couldn't it? What do you want for dinner? I'd get a Z9. No, I think it's obviously there are two questions there, aren't there? One of them is go zoom or go prime, and to deal with that first, it kind of depends on kind of on how you're already using your standard zoom. So let's assume that Jane has got like an 18 to 55 zoom, which is would be standard on that kind of camera body. If you find that you really like the freedom of moving throughout your focal lengths, then arguably getting a wide angle or an ultra wide angle zoom is going to be the way to go, because it will feel familiar to you and it will have that kind of versatility. If on these landscapes she finds that she is kind of steadfastly sticking to the 18mm end of that lens and not really kind of moving around very much at all, then arguably I'd say maybe do look at a prime, because it sounds like the way that you're working might be a little bit more kind of going down that route. In terms of the benefits of between the two, a lot of people feel that working with primes is a more kind of satisfying and kind of meditative process. Obviously it's the idea of kind of moving your feet rather than zooming the lens. On the other side, you can end up sort of missing opportunities because you don't have you don't kind of have that sort of scope to change the focal length. So get both. What I would say, and a Z9. But in terms of options, there are pretty well served actually. Kind of, so you're looking at a Canon EFS mount for that, or you could get an EF lens, like the kind of the full frame mount, but you would have to realize that you're going to be, in either case you're looking at a focal length conversion, but the EFS lenses will appear to be wider in their designation because that's kind of how they're pitched. And Canon do a 10 to 18 and a 10 to 22. The more affordable one of those, I think, is the 10 to 18, which might set you back just over sort of 200 quid. So it's not a kind of a super expensive lens. Sigma do a 10 to 20 famously. That was a great way back, like maybe 15 years ago. That was a big deal because they kind of, I think they did like a 3.5 fixed aperture version, and then they did a kind of a variable one as well, and they reviewed really well. And so I'd imagine that you can still find those. And like in terms of primes, I think there's less. There might be choice might be a bit more limited. But if you look for kind of companies again like Sigma, Samyang do a 14mm f2.8, which will give you something that will be a bit wider than the 18mm at the short end of the standard zoom, because obviously again you have to with a Canon APS-C camera like the 850D, you have to apply like a 1.6 equivalent or sort of conversion crop factor. But yes, Samyang, IRIX do one like a 11mm, which would work out as about a 17, I think, and Laowa do some sort of decent options. I think they have a range called, I know Will's tested these. They do a range called 0D, which means zero distortion, and they're kind of very wide lenses that kind of don't have much kind of, or any, I guess they would claim, kind of barrel distortion. So yeah, I mean there are options. There are plenty of options, and fortunately on that mount they're not that expensive. So it's not like you take the plunge and kind of feel like you're spending thousands. So but I think like ultimately, if I had to pick one, I'd probably go for like the Canon 10 to 18 or 10 to 22, because I think that will give lots of versatility, and they're good quality lenses.
I'd get the 10 to 18 just because it meshes in perfectly with her existing focal length, assuming that she's got an 18 to 55mm lens on the Canon. Anything to add, Will?
No, I think Kingsley's covered it all off. I mean, I
know, amazing, isn't it?
It's incredible. I mean, Jane doesn't mention how much she wants to spend on this wide-angle lens or prime or zoom. One thing I'll throw in would be the Tamron SP 10 to 24. I think it's around 530 odd quid at the minute. And that's a nice lens, which we've tested. And some of those Laowa ones, I know they're manual focus, which is kind of interesting as well and nice to use. But they are quite interesting because they do some very wide-angle lenses for decent money. And like I said, they're not particularly fast or anything, but they're quite worth looking at if manual focus is the way to go. And Samyang obviously is a very popular brand right now, and their AF technology seems to be coming on in leaps and bounds. And it's silent AF. It's wonderful.
Excellent. All right, good stuff. Well, thanks for that, chaps. Hopefully, Jane, that will help you out. So, as we wrap up another episode of the Photography News podcast, just a couple of things for me to say. First of all, if you've got a question which you'd like to send in to us, then please do use our email address, which is podcast@photographynews.co.uk. You can also get in touch with us on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter, and our handle for all three of those is @PhotoNewsPN. And if you want to read the very latest issue and you can't get into a retailer or you're not a part of a camera club, then you can do so on our website, which is photographynews.co.uk. So, having got all those plugs in, and with Kingsley's continually plugging the Z9 all the way through, we should finally end up with a Will's word of wisdom, as we do with all of our other podcasts. So, Will, what is your word of wisdom this time round?
Well, I had a meeting the other day. It was kind of a throwback in that I had a physical meeting in a pub with somebody, and it got me thinking about batteries and third power batteries. And Paul, thanks for coming along and buying me a glass of wine. And I know you listen to the podcast, so here's a shout out for you. But it got me thinking about third-party batteries, because we all need batteries, and especially the mirrorless cameras that eat through them. And buying, the actual camera brand can be quite pricey. And if you're a Canon owner, for instance, you have to spend 115 odd quid on a Canon backup battery. And it got me thinking about third-party, and of course, that got me to thinking what I own. And I do own third-party batteries, and I've no doubt you guys do too. And I've had third-party batteries dip out on me. They just seem to they seem to chug along nicely one day and then they're dead the next. Or you'd be using a camera and they'd be showing good signs of life on the camera, on the battery check signal in the camera, and then the next minute it's dead. But Paul got me thinking about this, and the brand he's now bringing in is called Newell, which is spelled Newell. And he left me some batteries to try, so he got me thinking about them. So I thought pass on those words of wisdom to our listeners and consider what you're buying. If you're buying a third-party battery, look for a decent brand and look at what Newell offer. And Paul's website is Phototech, as photo as in the word with TEQ.com, and have a look and just consider what they offer, because like I said, we all need batteries. Our cameras are nothing more than doorstops without them. Just buy the best you can afford, and it's got me thinking about it very much so anyway.
Good stuff, Will. Excellent. Now, all it took then for Paul to get a little mention on the podcast was for him to come along and buy you a glass of wine in a pub. So, Kingsley, it begs the question, what will you do for a glass of wine in the pub in terms of plugs on the podcast?
Well, I haven't been bought one, so I don't know.
Well, there's an opportunity. So, members of the photo trade, make your ways to Lincolnshire and buy Kingsley a glass of wine in the pub and see what you get out of it.
Or a Guinness. I mean, let's not go overboard.
Good stuff.
Actually, oddly enough, I did have a phone call from another person in the business who's just changed jobs, and he's got a marketing role. And he said, I've just taken this on. I know nothing about marketing. And I just said to him, it's dead easy. You buy the journos, free beer, and give them free stuff. Simples.
Are you listening, Nikon?
Well, on that
note, we're not that easily bought. Of course, we do have integrity. I am only joking.
Good stuff. Well, thank you very much, chaps. That just leaves me to say, and wrapping up, thank you very much to, well, where shall I go first? I'll go to you, Will. So, wine drinking and easily bribed editor of Photography News, Mr. Will Chung. Thanks, Will.
Thanks, guys. Good to see you. Stay warm.
Yeah, indeed. And thanks also to Guinness drinking and not so easily bribed contributing editor, Mr. Kingsley Singleton. Thanks, Kingsley.
I want that stricken from the record. I'm easily bribed. I don't want to present myself as not being open to a sort of to a snifter. Yes, but great, good to see you guys. Thanks as always for having me on.
No problem at all. And thanks also for tuning in and listening. And we'll be back in roughly a couple of weeks' time. Speak to you then. Cheers. This Photography News podcast is sponsored by MPB. Enjoy contact-free doorstep pickups which are safe, convenient, fully insured and completely free of charge. Plus, with 250,000 customers and 5 stars on Trustpilot, you can trust them and sleep easy.